This is totally awesome to have this many people come out for a program on what is actually turned into a sunny day. So thank you so much for coming. My name is Kathy Creedon. I'm the director of the John Jermain Memorial Library here in Sag Harbor. And I am so honored to be able to host this program. This is not a library-sponsored event, although I would have sponsored it given the opportunity. We are merely hosting the wonderful SANS organization. Having just finished a project with a historic building, I know better than maybe anybody else in this room that the buildings in Sag Harbor are our best documents. They tell us better than anything else who we are and where we've come from. So thank you so much for reaching out to us for this space. I'm really excited about it. We also collect other kinds of stories, and I would like to invite all of you to come to us, to share oral histories, to share your memories of the SANS neighborhoods, to share the histories of your families. I'd like to introduce briefly two of my colleagues who will be staying through this workshop. Susan Mullen, our wonderful reference librarian. How many of you have been helped by Susan Mullen in the past? Oh yeah, she is amazing. She is joined here today by someone you may not yet know, a woman named Rebecca Graby, who started with us this month as our local content librarian. She will be working with our existing historic documents to answer your questions, but even more importantly, she will be gathering your stories and adding them to our archives. So Rebecca, I'd love to introduce you to the people of Sag Harbor. They are the best people in the world. So Rebecca comes to us from the New York Historical Society, and all week I've been saying to her, this maybe isn't how you did it in the past, and she says, I love it. So I know she's a perfect fit for us. I'd also like to introduce Renee Simons, the president of the SANS organization, and SANS, as you know, is an acronym for the Sag Harbor Hills, the Azurest, and the Nineveh subdivisions of Eastville. So, Renee, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for saying yes. She said, we'll work this out and it'll work. And Rebecca, it's nice to know that you're collecting oral histories, because we actually have a bunch of oral histories that were taken as part of our survey. So I'll be happy to share those with you at any time. You can sit down. So welcome, welcome, welcome. It's really nice to see this audience. I know you're here because you care, and I know you're here because you want to learn. This is a tremendous opportunity to kind of share the history of SANS. Even people who have been within SANS have not really heard the complete story, because we were really kind of putting it all together for everyone and across the subdivisions. Many know a lot about it, but fortunately we were able to put all the dots together and have a wonderful story to tell. I will pass it over to Dr. Allison McGovern. If you don't mind, I'm going to read because I don't want to, yes?
I also should thank my colleague Eric, who isn't even scheduled today.
Yes. Can I have an applaud for that, Eric? Because not only is he taping this, but he agreed that we will get a copy and we will put it onto YouTube so that everyone who's not here will be able to see it as well. Okay? So, are you going to talk? You're going to talk about the journey to get to where we are.
Why don't you start with that?
Okay, let me talk a little bit about the journey. Back in 2015 or so, and by the way, I'm a neophyte versus most who are sitting in this audience. I came to Sag Harbor in 2003, and I bought a house. First, I tried to bid, and I didn't get the place. And people said, "Why are you here?" No, we're not selling. We're not selling. But finally, I found there was a house, and I bought it. And I was here, and I said, "Gee, there's so much history here. We really need to think about landmarking the area." Not to realize that a lot of other people were thinking the same thing. And sometimes you put one person's thought with another person's thought, coupled with, you know, changing an environment. You really do want to not kind of lose that history for your legacies, not only just within SANS, but also within the larger audience of Sag Harbor. So there was an opportunity to try to chronicle all that has happened. Why did SANS form? Why is it so important to American history? A lot of people really didn't realize that. Why is it so important to American history? And what really struck me, that historians who were not even part of SANS taught us some of the reasons why this was important to history. Not that we didn't know it was important, but the fact that no one had documented it before. And there were parts of American history that have not been captured. We kind of take it for granted. But if no one knows about it, then does it exist? So that's where we are. We said, let's document and see where we go. And then we were encouraged by the ARB to kind of go to the state to see if the state would be interested in pursuing this as a historic district, and we did do that. And I'm proud to say we self-funded it through private donations, and as well as 2 grants. I was reminded about that, Gardner and also Preserve New York. And so we're very proud to be here today to kind of introduce Dr. Allison McGovern. She's a senior archaeologist at VHB, I guess is a private firm, with more than 15 years of experience in archaeology, history, and oral history on Long Island. So she's a Long Island specialist. She provides expertise in a broad range of services and cultural experiences, cultural resource, compliance, and historic preservation services. She's also written a book called The
Archaeology of Race.
There you go. Archaeology, I got caught up in that, of race in the Northeast. And she also has done numerous articles about Long Island history, journals, Suffolk County Register, and Historical Archaeology, rather. Dr. McGovern is a member of the Suffolk County Parks Historic Trust Committee. Long introduction, I know, but well worth it. We're so proud to have worked with her on this project. It's been really a labor of love. I mean, when we talk to residents within Sag Harbor, it's really hard to get through the stories without some tears. So let's pass it over to her.
Thank you so much, Renee, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I'm really excited to see this turnout. I'm excited to see so many faces of people who I've talked to on the streets, in their homes, as I'm walking around, taking pictures, asking questions about SANS history. And I'm really glad that you're here because this is my opportunity to share what I've learned from you with you. Okay. So I'm going to start by introducing myself a little bit more. And everything that Renee said is accurate. I'm a professional archaeologist. I work for VHB, which is an engineering and land development company. And my work there is in the management of cultural resources. So it's a corporation that handles often large-scale development projects. But I come from a background in academics, in research and writing. And I started this project with SANS before my current position at VHB. So I want to make that perfectly clear. Now, as many of you know, my particular area of research interest is in the histories of so-called marginalized or subaltern peoples. The peoples whose lives and experiences have either been misrepresented, mythicized, or altogether ignored in our national and local histories. I also have a proclivity for community-based research that includes participation and input from community members whose histories I'm interested in, and this stems from my training in anthropology. As an anthropologist, I'm not only interested in research in the past, I'm also concerned with how the construction of history is inherently political. I'm interested in who's telling the story, about whom, and why certain stories get recorded or told. Sometimes my training as an anthropologist feels like it's at odds with the goals of my professional work. For instance, when reviewing historic resources against the criteria for the National Register of Historic Places. And it's at those times that I must remind myself once again how history is guided and controlled, for lack of a better word, by those who have the power to control it. This is how we seem to know certain histories so well and others less so. So I was, of course, incredibly excited to be invited to be your consultant to SANS, and to become involved in the community efforts towards historic preservation and documenting the historical legacy of the SANS neighborhoods. Mostly because of the great sense of interest and participation from SANS residents and supporters. One of the most powerful demonstrations that this project has made is the reliance on yourselves as residents, as descendants of SANS, and founders, and early settlers, and as interested members of the community, to collect and retell the stories and experiences of SANS over the past 50 or more years. As a consultant to SANS, my role was to gather the necessary data to complete the SANS Historic Resource Survey, which serves as the first documentary history of the SANS neighborhood. I relied on community participation in collecting oral histories, property information, photographs, memorabilia, and other relevant information for research purposes. And for all of your hard work, I am especially grateful. By spending time with you all, I was introduced to the rich history of SANS and some very important historical themes that I'm going to share with you today. These are all outlined in the Historic Resource Survey, which is just full of historical information and property-specific information, all of which I can't cover within the scope of this presentation. So we'll focus on the history today. But let's start with the purpose of the Historic Resource Survey. And the first main purpose of the survey was to document the historic resources located in Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh subdivisions, and that's where the acronym comes from. We were interested in identifying properties, districts, and themes within the SANS subdivisions that meet criteria for inclusion on the state and national registers of historic places. And we've since learned from the state that we received a determination of eligibility, as Renee mentioned, which is very exciting, based on criterion A for being associated with events significant to the broad category. Now the survey, the Historic Resource Survey, can also be used as a land use planning tool for the municipality. And by this I mean that the survey also provides an inventory of properties and their historical significance so that, as necessary, these properties can be reviewed. And so a survey like this will include inventories of buildings, structures, sites, properties, and neighborhoods. This survey in particular provides documentation of the physical environment of the 3 subdivision neighborhoods, and that documentation is presented against a narrative of historic context, which includes social and cultural history, to highlight the various criteria of significance for the neighborhoods. So with regards to my methodology, I focused, like most historical archaeologists, focused on multiple lines of data. And these include archival data, oral history information, field reconnaissance, and photography. Archival research was done at the Suffolk County Center in Riverhead, right here at the John Jermain Library in Sag Harbor, at the Eastville Community Historical Society, East Hampton Library, Long Island Collection, and with residents of SANS who possess private collections of documents, photographs, newspaper art clippings, and other ephemera, which I encourage to get archived in one place so that we can have a living archive of this material. These resources, along with oral histories, are the data that comprise the narrative context. Copies of tax maps of the SANS neighborhoods were purchased from Suffolk County Real Property Division in Riverhead, and these serve as the base map for the inventory properties. Properties on these maps correspond to tables of inventory properties that are provided in the appendix of the survey. Copies of 7 filed subdivision maps for Azurest, Sag Harbor Hills, Nineveh Beach, and Sag Harbor Beach Club, which later becomes incorporated into Sag Harbor Hills, were purchased from the Suffolk County Clerk's Office, and you'll see copies of those today. These maps are used in coordination with deed research and historical narratives to connect histories with properties. And in addition to this, we look at historic maps from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries to provide a history of the region, from wooded lots to mid-20th century residential developments. Copies of these maps were obtained through various archives and libraries. So the first step in the survey process was to determine the boundaries or limits of SANS for the purpose of establishing a proposed district. This process was at first dictated by the SANS committee, who shared information about the organized efforts of community members and by the geographic limits of active property ownership associations. Then it was further supported through documentation. So the SANS Historic Resources Survey study area is defined by the outer boundaries of those initially 4 subdivisions that become 3, as they were filed with Suffolk County in the middle of the 20th century. 7 subdivision maps were filed between 1947 and 1958, outlining the streets and the lots. Together, the survey area is bounded by Sag Harbor Bay to the north, Hampton Street to the south, to the west, Richards Drive, and all properties along Richards Drive are included within the survey area. And to the east, the survey area includes all properties along Lincoln Street, Wilson Place, and Taft Place. Altogether, the survey area comprises about 162 acres. As we begin to explore the history of SANS, the relationships that existed within and across neighborhoods, we will see that the boundaries of this district do leave out some neighborhoods, and consequently properties that share in the history making of SANS. Unfortunately, the National Register process forces boundaries to be drawn in a fixed way that sometimes marginalizes people from history, creating a false sense of the limits of historical significance and historical activity. This is noted in my survey research, and I've tried to be as inclusive as possible of events, people, and places that contribute to the historical themes and narratives that are significant to SANS, even if they are outside the boundaries of the proposed district. And this comes into play with some of my oral histories, some of the homes that I visited that are located in Chatfield Hills, Chatfields Hill, Hillcrest Terrace, and Eastville. Okay, so even though we have this neat little boundary, you know, history really expands beyond the limits of that boundary. Okay, so the Azurest, Sag Harbor Hills, and Nineveh subdivisions were planned, platted, and sold during the 20th century. The marketing toward an eventual settlement by middle and upper class African American people for vacation homes during the Jim Crow era make the origin of the neighborhoods uniquely distinct among East End settlements. But the origin of the SANS neighborhoods is not idiosyncratic. It is rooted in historical patterns of East End settlement. In fact, the development of SANS in this very location, immediately next to Eastville, is no coincidence. Eastville serves as an anchor community as it drew urban African-American professionals in the summers as early as the 1920s and 1930s. Eastville is historic in its own right, and this history has been documented in the 1980s expansion of the Sag Harbor Village National Register District, which includes Eastville. In the 1830s, the earliest settlements in Eastville emerge in the documentary record. And this was a section of Sag Harbor that was geographically distant from the waterfront, wealthy white village of Sag Harbor. Deep research demonstrates that white property owners, began to sell land in this area to people of color in the 1830s, although their names remained largely absent from maps until the 1870s. And what you see here is an 1854 map. I think it's Wallingham Forest, and it shows Eastville. Shows Eastville right over here, and it shows tracts of undeveloped land owned by Mulford and Slade over here, and Chatfields Hill, and those are the areas that expand, that eventually become expanded out in the 1930s and 1940s as Azurest and the other subdivisions become formed. Okay, so with regard to Eastville's history, it's important to keep in mind that African-descended people and other people of color arrive in Sag Harbor in search of employment in the profitable whaling industry before 1840. They joined skilled whalers of Montaukett, Shinnecock, and Manhasset ancestry who already lived and worked in the area. These men and women settled along Hampstead Street, Liberty Street, and Eastville Avenue, the earliest roads laid out on the eastern side of Sag Harbor. Many of them attended service at the Methodist Church in downtown Sag Harbor, where African Americans and Native Americans were segregated to the balconies and areas to the rear of the church. Around 1839, St. David AME Zion Church was organized, and the church building was subsequently constructed on Eastville Avenue. The church played a leading role in their everyday lives, bringing people of diverse backgrounds together. People began to settle there in large numbers after the establishment of the church, with neighborhood settlement expanding in size through the early 20th century. Now, according to the Eastville Community Historical Society, the Eastville neighborhood originated in the 19th century as a multi-ethnic community, comprised of three main groups: African Americans, Native Americans, and Euro-Americans. Often referred to as the quote-unquote historically black section of Sag Harbor, the memories and histories of resident families suggest a more integrated settlement occurred there in the 19th century that continued into the 20th century. The residents of Eastville were whalers, fishermen, farm laborers, seamstresses, launderers, and domestic workers, many of whom turned to manufacturing and service work at both large estates and summer resorts after whaling declined. The memories and family stories of several Eastville residents were captured and published in Voices of Sag Harbor, A Village Remembered. And at the time that their memories were recorded, many of the informants, who have since passed away, were elders sharing their childhood memories of the early to mid-20th century. Most of the informants recounted stories of their families who had resided in Sag Harbor for generations, while a few memories of seasonal vacationers were sprinkled throughout the volume. One important personal history in the volume was collected from Ms. Elizabeth Bowser, who lived on Liberty Street in Eastville. Her recollections and her kin are particularly important in understanding how and why SANS developed. She was born in 1919 to Aubrey and Jessie Bowser, and she was the middle of 3 children. Her older brother Garrison was named after abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, and her younger brother Hallowell was named after Colonel Hallowell, who commanded a black regiment during the Civil War. Her memories and experiences in Sag Harbor began as a young child. In fact, as early as the 1930s, her family, who was living in Brooklyn, began summering in Eastville, renting a house that they shared with other families. This seasonal trend was a long-standing tradition of her mother's family. Elizabeth Bowser's mother, Jessie Fortune, had also spent summers as a child with her family at Mary Jane Hempstead's home in Eastville. Jessie Fortune was a child of Carrie Smiley and T. Thomas Fortune. In fact, Carrie Smiley, Elizabeth's maternal grandmother, was the first of her ancestors to arrive in Sag Harbor. And Carrie Smiley was born into slavery, the daughter of a southern plantation owner and an Indian woman from the western frontier, and arrived in Sag Harbor in the late 1800s as a personal seamstress of a sea captain's wife. After her sweetheart from Florida, T. Thomas Fortune, pictured on the right, arrived in Sag Harbor, they moved to Brooklyn. T. Thomas Fortune was a newspaperman, an orator, and a civil rights activist. He published his own newspaper under several different names, which was a civil rights journal known as the New York Age, then the New York Globe, and the New York Freeman. Fortune was a part of the post-Reconstruction civil rights movement, supporting the work of Booker T. Washington, and he was an organizer of the National Afro-American League, which was a predecessor to both the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. Now, most significantly, in an 1886 editorial in his newspaper, T. Thomas Fortune wrote, he told his readers, rather than spend precious dollars at white-owned resorts and picnic grounds, they should build and support a black-owned public resort. A contemporary of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others, T. Thomas Fortune's comment is a powerful reminder of the network of black intelligentsia that was unsuspectedly connected to Eastville and the SANS subdivisions that were yet to come. W.E.B. Du Bois also wrote commentary on the color problem of summer in his magazine, the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. And we have this very connection through Fortune's family right here in Sag Harbor as a precursor to the development of SANS. How powerful is that? So in the early to mid-20th century, Eastville was host to a growing seasonal population. Full-time residents rented rooms and houses to seasonal visitors who sought an escape from their urban homes. They came to Sag Harbor to enjoy the beach, to fish, to breathe fresh air, and relax with their friends and family. Some stayed at Ivy Cottage, pictured here, located on Hampton Street, which was owned by Charlie Crippen's sisters. It remained a popular rental spot throughout the 20th century and served a Sunday dinner that was popular with black seasonal residents in the mid-20th century. Eventually, there developed an interest among some renters to be able to purchase their own resort properties so that they may return year after year. And this desire led to the early formation of SANS, beginning with Azurest. Now, initially, as many of you know, there were 5 subdivisions that were created in the mid-20th century: Azurest, Sag Harbor Hills, Chatfield's Hill, Nineveh Beach, and Hillcrest Terrace. 3 of these, Azurest, Sag Harbor Hills, and Nineveh Beach, were established northeast of Hampton Street, causing some of the properties in the 3 subdivisions to have beachfront real estate. Chatfield's Hill and Hillcrest Terrace were located southwest of Hampton Street. During the 19th century, these 5 areas were wooded and undeveloped, and they remained that way until the 1940s. All 5 of these subdivisions are historically linked, but the historic district nomination is focused on the Azurest, Sag Harbor Hills, and Nineveh subdivisions, based on community input and the historical integrity of homes and properties in the area. Historically, the properties that comprise Sag Harbor Hills, Nineveh, and Azurest were referred to as the Slate Tract, which I pointed out on that 1854 map. They were also known as Chatfield's Hill, which is also marked on that 1854 map. They've been referred to historically as the Nineveh Tract in the late 19th century, and the Baker and Conklin Farm. So there's these little clues in the historic documents to names and references to these areas before they become developed into SANS. Azurest was the first. This subdivision is located immediately east of Eastville. It was the first of the SANS neighborhoods to be platted and filed with Suffolk County. Two African-American sisters are largely responsible for the creation of Azurest, Maud Terry and Amasa Lee Meredith. Their parents were Emma P. Kenny, a black woman, and Samuel P. Meredith, a white carpenter. Kenny and Meredith traveled from their home in Virginia to Washington, D.C. to be legally married because interracial marriages were unlawful in Virginia. Their daughters, the Meredith sisters, became educators, educated themselves in Ivy League schools, and became educators as adults, and made a lasting impact on the formation and history of the Azurest subdivision. Their descendants, members of the Richards family, still live in what many people say is the first home constructed in Azurest, the Terry Cottage, which is shown on the lower right. Okay. Now, in Maud Terry's 1968 obituary, her descendant, Mrs. Hunter Terry, writes, and I quote, "The crowning monument to her memory," this is Maud Terry's memory, "is the founding of Azurest, a development at Sag Harbor, New York. It was a virgin tract of woods consisting of chestnut, oak, walnut trees, beech plums, deer feed, and other trees and shrubs. It is located between Hampton Street and Shelter Island Bay. There were only Indian trails and rough roads used by fishermen. 30 years ago, Mrs. Terry was a summer visitor to this place of natural beauty, where white sands, white clouds, blue sky, and blue waters meet. A place of silence, peace, and heavenly rest, where there was only peace, love, and beauty. There, Mom Maud was raised to the mountaintop, and there she had a dream. She envisioned homes among the trees, along the trails within sight of sunrises and sunsets over the bay. In her imagination, this place became heavenly peace, blue rest, blue haven, azure rest. From these descriptions and phrases, the name Azurest was coined. Immediately, Mrs. Terry began a diligent search up and down Long Island for the property owner. Finally, the Gales of Huntington, Long Island, were identified as the owners with no intention of developing the tract. But as Mrs. Terry's urgent insistence they considered, their son laid out plans and began developing the site. The Indian trails became Terry Drive, Richards Drive, and Meredith Avenue for members of Mrs. Terry's family. Walker Avenue and Milton Avenue memorialized Negro pilots of whaling ships. The name Cuffy Drive honored an old Sag Harbor Indian family. And that's all quoted from her 1968 obituary. The Terry family and residents credit Ma Terry with creating Azurest, but in academic circles, it's Amasa Lee Meredith, pictured here on the left, who's recognized as the founder. Maud was a New York City school teacher, and Amasa was an art professor, founder of the art department at Virginia State University, and one of the first documented black female architects. On the VSU campus, her home, named Azurest South, pictured on the upper right, is preserved and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In the VSU archives, there are rendered drawings for several homes that may have been built in Azurest, as well as Virginia and Texas. Okay. And I show these pictures here because they're two of the earliest homes that were constructed in Azurest. On the right, you see a group of ladies, and in the background is an early house that I believe was called Ed and Dot. And it was designed by Amasa, and presently it's incorporated into a larger structure, so remnants of this house are still there. And to the left is a house that no longer exists, but I think we might explore if this is one of those homes that was constructed or designed by Amasa. And this was Dr. Binga Disman's pink home on Terry Drive, which no longer stands. So the Azurest subdivision was filed in two sections. Section 1 was filed with Suffolk County by Elsie Gale in 1947. On this map, let me see if I have it, yeah. On this map, on the left, Section 1, 70 lots were laid out, mostly measuring 50 feet by 125 to 150 feet along Terry Drive, Milton Avenue, Richards Drive, Hempstead Street, and Meredith and Walker Avenue. And at that time, Meredith and Walker were short, dead-end roads extending from Terry Drive. Now, think about this. The planning of this plat, first plat, followed the existing topography. Richards Avenue was a new road laid out off Hempstead Street that extends north toward the shore. They basically make a beeline for those beachfront properties, and then extend into Milton Avenue, following a sharp turn, which in turn ended at Terry Drive. Terry Drive ran parallel to the shoreline, and all the lots laid out on the north side of the road possessed beachfront. Maud and Ameza relied on the help of friends and colleagues in platting and selling the Azurest lots. Dorothy Spaulding, an attorney, whose home I showed you in the previous picture, was instrumental in providing legal counsel. Their friend, James Smith, a civil engineer, provided guidance on establishing physical boundaries to the subdivision that would limit white encroachment, although this is an area of debate among current residents. We'll talk about that later. Together, they formed the Azurest Syndicate, which regulated the subdivision's lot sales, planned infrastructural land improvement projects, and guided the direction of the resort community. The syndicate was incorporated in 1953. Apparently, none of the syndicate members had any experience with community building. But they did reach out to investors who were their personal friends, among them Edna Mead Colson, a college professor, and Iris Terry Richards, a doctor and relative of the founders. The Azurest Syndicate was formed as both a governing body and a financial institution. They were primarily concerned with selling lots in Section 2, which are depicted in the subdivision map to the right, at a profit that would cover a 10-year mortgage with Elsie Gale. In 1948, Section 2 of the Azurest subdivision was filed by Elsie Gale in Suffolk County. The Section 2 subdivision map outlined the continuation of Milton, Meredith, and Walker Avenues toward Hampton Street, and added Cuffy Drive and Cadmus Road to accommodate an additional 200 lots. Like those in Section 1, most of the lots in Section 2 measured about 50 feet by 125 feet, with exceptions at corners and end lots. On the subdivision maps, the land east of the Azurest subdivision is noted as formerly J.E. Baker, which again is a reference to the Baker and Conklin farms mentioned earlier. All lots sold in Sections 1 and 2 of Azurest include rights to use the reserved beach in common with other Azurest owners. Okay? This is a really important point, that they're planning the shared use and shared rights as well as conservation of beachfront properties in their neighborhood. So Fred Richards, whose mother was Dr. Iris Richards and his grandmother Maud Terry, remembers coming to Azurest as a child. His mother was raised in New York City and maintained connections there through her sorority and medical field. She sent out word to her friends that lots of land were available for sale in Azurest, and that's how people arrived. The next subdivision to develop was Sag Harbor Hills, which lies east of Azurest. But in 1949, the Sag Harbor Beach Club subdivision was filed by the Sag Harbor Development Company, Inc. in Suffolk County. Sales appear to have been slow in the early years, as only 3 property deeds were filed in 1951. And according to the 1949 subdivision map shown on the left, 71 lots were laid out between Soundview Ave and Hampton Street along Beach Avenue and Harbor Avenue. Harboy Place and Hillcrest Drive are mapped as short cross streets connecting Beach Avenue and Harbor Avenue. The beachfront property is marked as reserved. The documented owner of the land east of Sag Harbor Beach Club subdivision was Hugh F. Lynch, a white developer. Now, some residents in SANS recall that when lots were selling at Azurest, the neighbor who owned the lands to the east, comprising Sag Harbor Beach Club subdivision, was concerned by the growing presence of people of color in Azurest. He wanted to build a country club subdivision, but worried that the presence of black residents next door would cause problems for property values and sales. As a result, a narrow parcel was laid out between the two subdivisions. Okay? And you can see it if you look closely, a narrow strip about 25 feet wide all along the western boundary of the subdivision between this subdivision and the eastern portion of Azurest. This boundary symbolically and literally created racial distance, and it's visible on this Sag Harbor Beach Club subdivision map. Now, as Azurest gained in popularity, and perhaps out of concern for sales, Sag Harbor Development Company began to sell lots to people of color who were interested in buying, beginning in 1951. And the reserved beachfront property was subsequently divided into lots which were among the first to sell. These were purchased by people from Brooklyn and Manhattan, New Jersey, St. Albans, and Glen Cove, and included Richard and Dorothy Granger, Henry and Evelyn Letcher, and Dr. Oliver Holder. In 1950, the Sag Harbor Hills subdivision was filed by Hugh and Martha Lynch. Located east of Sag Harbor Beach Club, it included 84 lots between Hampton Street and the shoreline along newly proposed Hillside Drive West, Hillside Drive East, and cross streets Harboy Place, Gull Rock Road, and Nineveh Place. The reserve beach was located at the end of Hillside Drive East, and all lots sold within the subdivision had access to it written into their property deeds. Now, Mr. Bill Pickens, who's here today, a longtime resident of Sag Harbor Hills, says that as a child he vacationed with his parents and extended family members in Eastville. And one day, his father followed a bulldozer across Hampton Street and Hempstead Street toward the woods. A model home was under construction at the corner of Hillside Drive West and Harboy Avenue, and Mr. Pickens' father bought it. It remains in the Pickens family today. Bill's mother was a leader of the black social organization Jack and Jill, and his grandfather, I believe, was the founder of the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. Again, powerful connections to the black intelligentsia right here in Sag Harbor. Now, news of the newly available summer homes spread quickly through Jack and Jill, as well as other social black networks. Summer arrivals came from New York, New Jersey, Western Long Island, and as far as Chicago. After the Sag Harbor Hills Improvement Association was formed around 1960, the land within the Sag Harbor Beach Club subdivision here became absorbed by the Sag Harbor Hills Improvement Association. And the purpose of the association is to protect, conserve, and beautify the open spaces and beaches. Deeds for all properties in Sag Harbor Beach Club and Sag Harbor Hills subdivisions include rights to use the reserve beach. Okay, the third subdivision is Nineveh Beach. It's the last, temporally, it's the last of the three SANS subdivisions to be formed. It was platted by Sag Harbor Associates, which was owned by Mr. Francis Ruland, and filed in Suffolk County in 3 sections, and that's why you see 3 separate subdivision maps here. Let's see. In Section 1, 54 lots were laid out along newly drawn Harding Terrace, Taft Place, Wilson Place, and the northern section of Lincoln Street. The map was filed in 1953. Along the north side of Harding Terrace, there were 27 lots measuring 30 feet wide and extending from Harding Terrace to the shoreline. Because the lots were so narrow, multiple lots had to be purchased to accommodate home construction. Section 2, filed in 1957, included lots 55 through 81 along Lincoln Street. And then Section 3 included lots 80 through to 97 along Lincoln Street and Hampton Street, filed in 1958. Nineveh Beach is the only one in SANS to contain privately owned roads. People began to purchase property in the private subdivision in the 1950s, and property ownership included membership in the Nineveh Beach Property Owners Association. Road maintenance has always been funded by annual dues in the association. Early residents in Nineveh Beach include Jay Howard and Natalie Payne, whose son is here today, as well as the Brannon, the Romaine, and the Barnes families. Sag Harbor Associates, which later became Nineveh Beach Property Owners Association, regulated access to and conservation of the reserve beach, the installation of utilities, and the approval of house specifications. In 1959, Mr. Payne formally registered the subdivision as the Nineveh Beach Homeowners Association. All deeds for property in Nineveh Beach included access rights to the reserve beach. In addition to this, and this is unique among the subdivisions, there are several restrictions listed in the deeds, including that no business or manufactory of any kind or for any purpose whatsoever shall be conducted upon premises hereby conveyed, nor shall any hotel, apartment house, or boarding house be erected or maintained thereon. Building specifications are to be approved by the Nineveh Beach Property Owners Association, and no dwelling to be erected at a cost of less than $7,500. So the residents took great care in planning their homes within the subdivision. So property deeds also included an expiration date for these restrictions, the most recent of which was 1970, which notes the regulation of housing stock. After 1970, these regulations are no longer included in the deeds and no longer implemented. So the planning of these neighborhoods, including beach access, lot sizes, and in some cases, even reviews of the building styles and sizes, make them representative of mid-century development trends that were marketed toward middle-class homebuyers. And that's one of the really important contexts and themes that came out of the historic research for SANS. I looked at several categories of information, and these are the strongest things that come out. Neighborhood planning, experiences under Jim Crow segregation, social networks, and financing and building. Okay. So even though these developments arrive or are constructed at a time when there's a growing market trend towards middle-class home buyers, we also have to think about the people that are settling in this area during this time period. Right? So the historical composition of the buyers, along with the sense of identity and the community culture that was created by its mid-century residents, make the social history of these suburban neighborhoods even more significant. Okay? During the post-war period, through the GI Bill, veterans returning from the war could buy mass-produced homes and go to college. However, this was a world of segregation, from military to education and suburban development. People of color experienced the inequity and degradation of segregation in all facets of their lives. Okay? African Americans faced discrimination with banks and education through institutionalized racism and government-sanctioned segregation practices. New middle-class opportunities like housing and financing were thus not distributed equitably by race during this period. Black resorts and beaches developed along the East Coast during the Jim Crow era as a response to racism and segregation. Highland Beach in Maryland, American Beach in Florida, Atlantic Beach in South Carolina, and Oak Bluffs in Massachusetts are just a few of the black resort areas that were established and rose to prominence. The origins of these places, including Sag Harbor, are rooted in early 20th century civil rights activism. There's no question that in the early 20th century, members of the black intelligentsia discovered Sag Harbor and recognized its potential as a vacation spot for people of color, owners, renters, and house guests. Indeed, such memorable house guests as Lena Horne and Langston Hughes are documented in photographs and home videos. As the culture of the black middle and upper classes developed into the 1940s, the demand for accessible resort areas and vacation homes grew stronger. The SANS subdivisions evolved in response to these demands. Social networks were key to establishing a foothold in SANS. And this is not just in the origins of SANS. Through my experiences with some of you in our oral histories, I've learned that even in the 1980s and the 1990s, getting a property in SANS was all about networking, right? Contacting people who had connections to properties. When is something going to become available? Okay? So this method of marketing is unique for the time, especially in the 1940s. As planned suburban developments across Long Island and throughout the country, at that time typically used marketing campaigns to promote developments to subsets of American society, whether those were for white residents or black residents. But this was not the case with SANS. Social circles, social organizations, and shared workplaces were all venues where information was shared. The lack of overt marketing campaigns and reliance on social networking for generating consumer interest led to a sense of safety and community, right? As well as a sense of elitism that continued through the end of the 20th century. And a glimpse of the historic property deeds for the earliest SANS consumers indicates that buyers from the subdivisions came from similar neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, St. Albans, Glen Cove, parts of New Jersey, and Chicago, to name a few. This was all mentioned in oral histories, in the ethnographic research that I conducted with many of you. So it means that people knew each other at their year-round homes, you know, in urban centers and during the summers. And it created a really intense sense of comfort and community. Teachers, doctors, dentists, lawyers, and other professionals knew each other from workplaces and from year-round neighborhoods, but they were often also part of the same black social organizations and attended the same Ivy League and historically black colleges. Organizations like the Comus Club, Jack and Jill, the Girlfriends, the Boulay and the Lynx, as well as other black sororities and fraternities, were established in the early 20th century by people of color to develop social networks and to socialize their children among successful, socially connected black professionals. The Divine Nine refers to the 9 fraternities and sororities that make up the National Pan-Hellenic Council. And that council was founded in 1930 at Howard University. The families of color with college-educated people are usually connected to one or more of these Greek organizations, and they shared information about where they vacation, where they stay, you know, how they spend their time, what they're doing. Jack and Jill, as I mentioned earlier, was a family-oriented social organization designed to connect families with young children of color and provide access to successful adults as mentors. Knowledge of the beachfront properties in Sag Harbor that were available to people of color quickly traveled through these groups. So social networks created a strong sense of belonging for those who were already socially accepted. And membership in many of these organizations were often by invitation. These social organizations created, as I said, a sense of safety and community, but also a sense of society. Okay? And that sense of society carried over to SANS. These organizations were designed to establish, I said that already, okay. All right, you get it, right? So, the last important context that I want to bring up is financing and building, okay? And during the Jim Crow era, we know that racist legal policies were established at the national and the state levels to create segregated spaces. The legacies of these policies, which include segregated settlement patterns, poverty, bigotry, and institutionalized racism, remain steadfast in American society and culture. For instance, the Federal Housing Authority, created in 1934 to provide government-insured mortgages to home buyers, but African Americans were explicitly excluded from this program. And the policy of redlining was government-supported and led to nationwide segregated housing patterns. As a result, people of color were forced to either pay for new homes in cash or negotiate other means of loans or repayments with individual sellers and real estate companies. In many parts of the country, including Long Island, the legacy of redlining is visible today in our contemporary segregated landscapes, and even still in deed clauses. Because people of color could not rely on FHA-insured loans or banks to offer them, they found alternative means for home purchasing. And that's how many of the properties in SANS were acquired. Okay? For SANS consumers, it's important to note that their purchases were for second homes. Okay? This is demonstrating the socioeconomic status and perhaps better options than were available for many other people across the country. But there were also creative ways of helping each other out, right, and supporting each other in acquiring these properties. So in Azurest, we remember that the Property Owners Association formed the Azurest Syndicate, Incorporated, which regulated the subdivision's lot sales, planned infrastructural land improvement projects, guided the direction of the resort community, and eventually also provided mortgages to buyers. Now, not all buyers in Azurest used syndicate mortgages to purchase homes. Many people used savings and more benefits to purchase their properties and homes in cash. This was also the case in Sag Harbor Hills and Nineveh Beach, where syndicate mortgages were not available. So we have diverse strategies, right, throughout the SANS neighborhoods and property acquisitions. Now, I can't cover all of the data covered in the survey, but what I've introduced to you here are large themes and contexts in the history of SANS and how it's connected to Eastville as an anchor community. What I wanted to end with is some of my reflections in having spoken with many of you, collecting oral histories, collecting information on property forms that I distributed and that many of you helped distribute throughout the community. Information that I wanted to get about connecting people to properties, connecting families to locations. I had informal conversations with many of you, and just first-hand sources from all of the residents. And I recall some of the information that informants and history brokers, as I like to refer to you all as, is important to understand the SANS significance, right? Because everyone who participated in SANS is invested as a stakeholder in these properties, right, in the district, stakeholders in the history, and is also making a statement about how this history can and should be told. Okay? And so there were things that popped out in some of your oral histories. A lot of social events, a lot of fun times between people, including parties, barbecues, sharing spaces, sharing homes to people at different points throughout the summer to have barbecues and parties. There were calendars that were constructed by some of you with birth dates and events on them. Right?
It's right there.
Yes. And newsletters, right? And some of those newsletters I was able to see, giving updates about people, their activities, right? Family activities. There were parades that were organized, right, with children, and just some really wonderful experiences. Lots of people noted some of the well-known or famous people connected to the Harlem Renaissance who came to visit and stay, even if it was for a night, if it was for a week or the summer. Okay, these were important activities. That there was excitement, that there was fun, that there was community, a sense of community, and a sense of safety, right, that was happening in SANS, and that people were welcomed, right, to spend time with family and friends. There were notable African-American entrepreneurs that stayed as either visitors or owners in SANS over the years, and people in very high positions, okay? People with Ivy League educations, high-paying jobs, with powerful positions, and making the statement that I want to stay here with my friends and family, and I want to come back, year after year, generation after generation. People also noted that SANS, even though it's represented by a largely seasonal population, makes a significant contribution to the local tax base. And as SANS started to develop, right, SANS residents, seasonal residents, patronized nearby businesses. And so this was happening at a point when I think there was a bit of a struggle, economic struggle in Sag Harbor. And SANS, people arrive and start spending money, right? Another thing that was noted was access to public amenities. And this, Renee and I were just talking about this earlier. In 1977 is a really important point in SANS history. And that's when connections to public water were made. And this was all self-funded by residents of SANS. Roads became paved and maintained by the village, with the exception of Nineveh subdivision. And this movement towards public amenities and having the village come in and pave roads was sort of there were two sides. There's benefits and concerns at the same time. Benefits in the sense that SANS having access to these new and improved roads. But new and improved roads also means that there's less of a sense of security or limitation. Okay? Some of the people that I spoke to remembered that when roads were dirt throughout the SANS subdivisions, it was less likely that somebody who wasn't from SANS would enter those roads. Once they became paved, there was more movement from people who weren't living in SANS, right? Movement from outsiders into the SANS community. And so while this was a beneficial improvement, it also meant that SANS was a little bit more open to, to the experiences that they were previously protected from. And that brings up the issue of safety again. Over and over again, SANS developed as a place of comfort and safety and community. And this is a very important thing in the history of the SANS subdivisions. I wanted to end with those ideas, those sort of the input of the oral histories, which are further going to be explored in writing the narrative for the National Register nomination form, and which will eventually also be archived for future research purposes. But I mean, I think as you can see at this point, SANS history is pretty incredible. And it happened right here in Sag Harbor. You have a sense of community, you have intersections of race and class developing in a very unique way on waterfront property in Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh. And moving forward with the national nomination form really sort of solidifies the legacy and the important history that has formed here over the past 50 plus years. Okay. So thank you for giving me the time to present my findings to you. Research is of course ongoing, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about my research with the SANS subdivisions.
I'm going to ask the first question. A lot of times I get questions like, well, why did African Americans feel the need to really have this section? And you spoke a little bit about the times, post Jim Crow, many African Americans weren't allowed in a lot of areas. Could you talk about the legal covenants that were written that explicitly stated this is set up, and oh, by the way, must legally exclude blacks? Could you talk about the covenants that existed?
Well, I think that's something that Andrew Carl did a really good job of speaking about at his last presentation, and hopefully many of you were able to attend to that. And so, yeah, so black resort areas, his research focuses more on those specific covenants. And so I encourage you all to, to get a copy of his 2 books that work specifically with that. I think what's interesting about SANS, though, is that it develops at the same time period as those restrictions, and that is what's so key to developing a sense of community. And I was going in another direction too, and I lost my train of thought. But okay.
Okay. And another question I know someone posed to me this past week was, well, that was then. Yeah, but this is 2018. Why now? Why do historic designation? Why is it so important to African Americans today?
Okay, so I can't answer this question specifically. I can only offer the information that I have encountered in the oral histories with people in SANS. And I know that designation is an important part of the legacy. It's an important part of documenting and ensuring that the documentation of this story and this history is here. Okay, it is an important honor that's bestowed on the neighborhoods, and I know that that is something that was of interest to many of the residents. Why is it important now? I think it's because one of the reasons is because that this is one of those histories that hasn't been highlighted either in local history or national history. And highlighting that history doesn't exclude people from enjoying the benefits of living or exploring SANS. It simply shows the world how important this history really is.
And if I could just add, because I know some people didn't attend Andrew Call's presentation in terms of the history. So there were many, many communities that were formed. I would say 100 plus, I think was the number he quoted, around the United States. Of those that were formed in that period, SANS is one of the last remaining communities in the United States. Bill Pickens talks about the last mile. SANS is the last mile of primarily African-American owned beachfront in America. There's 5,000 miles of beach shores, and SANS is really the last and only property that's primarily owned by African-Americans. So that will give you a sense why it's a little emotional. Plus, I think you stated it, but I just would like to emphasize, this is a generational thing, meaning families came in the 40s and 50s and may have visited here in the 30s and 40s. And we have many of the original families still owning the properties. I would venture to say that 60, maybe 70% of the properties, is that too bold?
No, I think that's...
Are still in the hands of the original families who formed these 3 subdivisions back in the 40s and 50s. There was one other...
one other point I'd like to make is and Andrew Call does a really good job of talking about beach access for people of color. And a lot of his research does tend to focus, though, on public spaces, okay? Public spaces that excluded people of color through laws to access to these places. And so not just public resorts, but what's unique about SANS is that this is a private development that is trying to ensure access to beach property generation after generation. So there is a distinction here between public beaches that either did or did not provide access to people of color. And here people are consciously developing this area with safety, in mind.
And then one last point, and then I'm going to go around and take questions. And I'm going to use my hands to explain, and it's backwards for some of you. Well, I don't have the numbers, but just to explain. So in Andrew Call's slides, he shows that right after slavery in the 1950s, African Americans owned about this amount of land. I don't have the exact number, but this amount of land. And then after that, the land in aggregate rose and rose and rose. And then because of legal things like eminent domain, heir laws, which then said if you had 12 heirs and one of them said I wanted to sell, that would trigger...
Partition sales, that's right.
Yeah, partition sales, force the rest to have to sell. And so the land ownership of African Americans went down, 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 down. And in 2000, the amount of land that is owned primarily by African Americans as acreage is less than the land owned right after slavery, which is another reason why this land is so emotional for us. So with that, I'd like to open up for questions. First of all, before you do that, I see there's some people from SANS. For those whose families were one of the original families in SANS, could you just raise your hand so you can see? Okay, and you're still here. Okay, could I ask for questions? Sure.
I'm Margaret Bromberg, but I grew up here as Margaret Abelman. You spoke about the contribution of the residents of SANS to the economy of Sag Harbor in the 50s and 60s. I wonder too about, because I think that there was a significant philanthropic contribution related to the Bridgehampton community, Dr. Desmond, yes, I think, and I wonder if that's going to be included in any of the history.
Yes, there was indeed. I'm limited by the amount of time that I have to be able to cover all of the research, but again, this is a really historically significant area, and philanthropy is a big part of the social activities of SANS residents. So getting involved in important activities like with the Bridgehampton. In fact, there's residents here who could probably speak even better to these experiences, if anybody is willing to share.
Memories? That Dr. North is not, Dr. North, Robert North was very much involved with that as well. And to quickly tell the story, I think, I mean, I have this right, so I know somebody will correct me, that there were workers who were in Bridgehampton. I think for some reason, who can tell the story better than I can?
And Kathy Tucker, the founding historian for Eastville Historical.
Can you tell the story, Boo?
And the Turners.
Yeah.
Better than I.
Well, yes, back in the 30s and 40s, the African American community consisted of periodic potato pickers who came up from the South and lived along the Bridgehampton Sag Harbor Turnpike in very frail homes. But they were seasonal, and they were brought up, and then they went back after when the winter was setting in, and they'd come back in the spring, and they were a whole community of potato pickers. They were largely constituted the African American community here, although there were a few school teachers and doctors and so forth who came out periodically. But that was really, they took the place of the slaves who were in the whaling business back in the 1830s, who became the whale boat developers and whale boat crews. So it was basically an impoverished community that came here seasonally. Then things heated up in the 40s.
Then there was a fire, I understand.
Well, there was a fire. Yeah, there was a fire. There was very little protection for these folks. These were very frail homes, and they did not have resources to
And
make up.
apparently, what I understand is that their children, the children that they had were they were hurt. And I think Desmond and some others decided to put together a way, a place, for a safe place for children of these workers to kind of come after school or stay and be safe and be overseen. So that's a little bit of the story. You should see Killer Bees because it is a great story of what happened since. Another question? And I started over here, sorry.
Good afternoon, I'm John Brannon, and wow, as a child, when you talk about the economics of Sag Harbor, growing up in this area where we had parents who kept us for 2 weeks segments during the summertime because most of our parents worked and didn't have a whole summer off. I remember going into the village and going to the 5 and 10 in different places and spending money and being said, "Thank you, sir," when I spent my money in those places. It was quite unusual to grow up in an area like this where you had that privilege. And that's pretty much it right now.
Yes, thank you so much. And I encourage a lot of the residents to continue to share their experiences as we move forward.
I'd like to introduce Ed Dudley, if I could just also say. So here's a little bit of trivia, but it's important history for SANS. His father was the first African American ambassador appointed by the United States. And he was appointed under Truman, President Truman. He was also borough president, I believe, in Manhattan. So this is his son.
Hi, my name is Ed Dudley. We started coming out in 1949 and stayed. I just wanted to give you a little idea of what it was like. We stayed with the Normans, Gerald and Edna Norman, which were sort of cousins. And then my father bought. But a lot of blacks that lived in New York City were really from the South. My father came up from Roanoke, basically because he didn't like the fact that teaching in a segregated school, he got half the money that someone else with the same credentials in a white school. So that's how he emigrated. But he still liked the country, the fishing, and he used to come out to Riverhead and rent, and then finally heard about through the networking about Sag Harbor. And it was a wonderful place for me because in New York, my parents were very much into education. I went to Fieldston, which is a private school, but it was all white. So it was great for sports and education, but socially, I had my first girlfriend from coming out in Sag Harbor, a lovely young lady from Westchester. what amazes me is there were more parties back then, even though we have hundreds of homes now than there are now. And you'd come down and you were totally safe to walk anywhere around. We hitchhiked to town to see the movies and things. But, and we went fishing. We bought a boat with Mr. Foots Gray, my father's friend, and we went out fishing and caught porgies and blowfish. And it was just a wonderful experience. And I think there were a lot of Southerners that came up and wanted to have this country. My father played tennis with Chuck Jones and Norman and I just know a lot of people here. So I just wanted to explain that.
That's great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing too, because it brings up a lot of points that I couldn't include everything in the presentation, but there's a lot of relationships, marriages that happened in SANS, right?
Yes.
Unions between, long-standing families. Yep. Yes. And just in general, the African American experience in Sag Harbor is diverse. It's not one homogeneous, it's not one specific set of experiences. We have a lot of people coming from diverse areas, diverse backgrounds, urban centers, southern areas, and all establishing a new sense of community in the 20th century, which I think is a really important thing to think about when we think about a community like SANS.
Steve?
Well, first I want to say, Renee, a real deep overdue thank you. I had thought about documenting the history of Sag Harbor, and I thought that we were losing it, and after a couple drinks I talked to some other friends about it, but never anticipated just how challenging this would be, and to do something so complete and so thorough. And again, you have helped, as they say, as you alluded to, history is written by the winners. And I'm not sure if we're going to stay winners here. So this was a great opportunity to get our chance to put our stake in the ground, as well as our personal history and the history of Sag Harbor. And the fact that a lot of people who dealt in social justice and health, and a lot of people came through here. And we, like Eddie, our house was finished in '53, and I was 3 weeks old when the house was finished. It just occurred to me, by the way, only 5 years ago, that I was a surprise baby, because I had an older sister, and they built a 3-bedroom house, and I ended up taking the guest room. But as Eddie says, it was a wonderful place to grow up. You mentioned safety, which was very, very important. Getting back to that whole baby thing, we used to have party lines out here. So you couldn't really call and say anything bad about it, because you didn't know who was listening for entertainment. We could hardly get TV out here. So it was common that I was kind of an adventurous little child, and when I was running around in my diapers, people would pick up the line and say to the operator, I think it's Gail or Carol, yeah, we see Stevie. And he's running across our lawn and he's going in towards so-and-so. So when my mother really wanted to fetch me, she could find out where I was. We had the advantage, John, of my mother being a teacher, so the kids had the full summer out here. And it was just a wonderful thing. I do have to say, we felt safe not only in SANS, but also on the streets of Sag Harbor. I think there was a peaceful coexistence, and I think really people underestimate just how strong the influx of fresh cash into this economy was. You think of all those houses, all the plumbers, all the carpenters, all the supply houses, all the grocery stores, restaurants, butchers, liquor stores. All of them did very well. And you talk about the parties, you're right, we didn't lock doors, and I'll finish now, but we didn't lock doors. We came down, and that's the level of safety that we felt. And once again, thank you and you for doing such a thorough job. Appreciate it.
If I could just mention, if I could just clarify.
Something that was kind of touched on, and before I give the other lady, that if you can imagine, I know those who are from Sag Harbor, most of everybody is here who's here. Remember those days when you could just walk out, and if you did something 3 doors down, that person is like your mother and said, "No, you got to go back," and that was the experience. So if the children were on the beach. And they were adults there, they looked out for everyone. It didn't have to be your child. And that is when Allison talks about a sense of community, that's the community. That's the community where everybody's your aunt, everyone's your uncle. It's also the sense of community where, gee, I didn't see you last week, is everything okay? How's your mother doing? Or the one thing that I miss now as other folks are coming in and they've not been really in SANS very long, I'm used to saying good morning. So if you're walking your dog or whatever, you say good morning or good afternoon or good evening or have a great day. Those are the things and the characters and values that are there that I hope, no matter what, don't go away, but that was really very important too.
Thank you. My name is Prudence Talmadge Carabine, and I run the Farm Museum in East Hampton. And we in East Hampton have our own tricultural experience, as you know, from Freetown through North Main Street, that we're working hard to explain for the first time, really, to our community. And I have one question that's always concerned me. I'm 70 years old. I grew up with my grandfather, who was Ferris Talmadge, a local man and politician and farmer. And I asked him once about the Ku Klux Klan. And he would not talk about it with me at all. And that was an unusual thing because he explained everything else there was to know to me as a kid. But I have since come to know that Sag Harbor did have some Klan activity during, I think, what they called the third orientation of the Klan during the 20s. And I just wondered if that experience is anything that anyone could speak to, because I knew that in East Hampton we did have this is only anecdotal, I don't have any proof of this, but I understand that the Brill store on North Main Street was approached by the Klan at one point, and that's the only reference I have to violence. But I wondered if there was any effect that you can explain.
Yeah, I can speak just a little bit to it, and then I wanted to tie it into how our sense of safety is changing recently. But just as a kid, my family is in the second wave. We came in 60, 61 out here. I don't think there was an LIE, as I remember. We came 24 and 20. Yeah, we came 24, 25 from Queens. So the rule with my family is Southern. The rule was once we left, we couldn't stop till we got to the Howard Johnsons in Riverdale. It was the only safe place because of Klan. You could not stop in Hampton Bay. I still won't go to Hampton Bay. Hampton Bay, all these small towns, speed traps, and the one thing you never wanted to do was get caught by the police on the road. When I was growing up, there was a young man caught on the road coming home who the sheriff caught and beat. We were safe inside of SANS, and we walked in groups to town, but there were places that wouldn't serve us. Paradise, we used to pay in pennies because they were so nasty to us. 5 and dime was always following us. So there is that opposite side. I wanted to speak to go from that into security, because once you got here, everything was wonderful. We had no lights on the streets. We had dirt roads. You walked around at night, usually without a flashlight. You knew the roads so well. When you hear somebody coming, you would call out, "Who's that?" And they would identify themselves, and you talk and keep on going home. We were really, really free out here. This year, there's been a couple of this year and last, but there's been a couple of incidents. One well publicized, the one with the on-air personality, Sunny Hostins. Nasty things happened at her house. My neighbor next door, a young man in about his 30s, was talking to his cousin who lives on the other side of me,
in their car about 3 o'clock in the morning. The people who across the street who were renting for the weekend or whatever called the police and said that they thought there was something suspicious happening in the car, and the 3 cop cars and 6 cops came immediately, made them get out of the car. They had to go and identify themselves, even though they said, we live here, literally right here. This is our home. They were checked for warrants. This is all sitting out in front of their house. 2 weeks ago, we, as they talked about the public beach, as a community, we have long decided no dogs on the beach. We have signs posted everywhere, and we chastise people when they come on the beach with the dog. I chastised someone 2 weeks ago when they came on the beach with the dog. About an hour later, they left. I left. I was about 2 blocks behind them. It was a group of adults, 3 men, 3 women, a man. A man leaves his group. I was 2 blocks behind. He leaves his group, comes back, confronts me with his phone and says, I'm calling the police, you're stalking me. I feel intimidated, I feel threatened. He calls 911, says it loud enough for me to hear, this is in the middle of the day, that he's being stalked by a black woman. She's wearing a political shirt. And then I hear him answer the people on the phone, and I hear him say, weapons? Oh, I don't know, she might have a gun. 5 minutes later, 3 cop cars, 6 cops come to assess the situation. So our sense of security is really being, again, as Renee said, it's very emotional for us. I am angry all the time about things that are happening in my community I have no control over. It's not just happening to us, happening all over, but the commercialization, Airbnb, people renting to transients, we don't know them, and they apparently don't know, even though we have signs saying historically black community, they don't seem to know. So we look threatening, for someone to look, and he described me as elderly, which means...
I believe she's a PhD.
I happen to have 2 incidents that I want to speak of, one of which I was arrested. I'm still dealing with trying to get a decision on that. But Albert Granger, anybody who has an extended relationship with Sag Harbor also knows about rum and coke. Albert, I would say he was 18 months to 2 years old when he would walk around Sag Harbor with the 2 dogs. And people would call up the Grangers just to let them know where Albert was and that the dogs were still protecting him. And it's a legendary story about our community and the safety that was there, because as families, we watched out for each other. And many of the folks were aunts and uncles with no blood relations. And it was just a wonderful place to grow up and live. And I happened to be one of the first to purchase my own home here and raise my daughter. So Sag Harbor is a very special place to me. And thanks for doing this.
So on another note, because yes, things are changing and everyone is noticing. We're not feeling, we'd be...
one more shot.
I'll be there in a sec. We will be misrepresenting it. Everything is peachy honey. Things are changing, scary changing a little bit. But we still have ladies' night, and I know Vicki participated. And she said, does everybody know about this ladies' night, right? And we have funds. We go out to restaurants and stuff, and at the end of the season, we have circles on the beach where we wish everybody, fair travel, safe travel and farewell. The guys go play golf. There's a lot of book clubs. So there's a lot of things that anybody does. But we definitely make it into the summer in SANS. I think one person else would, yes?
I don't need it.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Gloria from Brown. I live in Tatfields Hill, one of the 5 communities. Tatfields Hill, I would guess, has maybe 3 of the original families living in it. Our community is about 85–90% Caucasian. So we did not participate because most of us who are living there are, I would guess, well, my cousins, the Whitmires, probably were among some of the original ones. They have, well, I have a cousin living there, and I think the Salmons, Mehmet Carter, I don't think there's anyone else. My husband and I purchased our property in 1983. And so everybody else that's there is fairly recent. And so there is not a lot of history there in terms of people available to talk about the old days. And my cousin Reggie is younger than I am, and he can talk about growing up around here and coming out in the summer, but he does not know a lot, I would guess, about some of the early things that are in your report. So I just want to point that out, that we are very much support, those of us who are there are very much supportive of the three communities that are joined together across the highway, as we say. And so it is not because we are averse to what you're doing. It's simply that we felt we did not have a whole lot to contribute. And we are not joined by the way you are joined.
So when we decided, because that may be a question, what happened to the other two areas? At the time we were trying to make decisions, we were looking for established subdivision, active subdivisions. Right. And you know, the criteria within historic, and actually, Susan, you can probably speak to it more, about how, Sarah, I'm sorry, not Susan, Sarah, that's not your name, Sarah, about how you get cohorts of areas that are significant. You want to just talk to that? Or is there anything that I didn't touch on? Basically, it's usually where a significant portion of a locale is, in fact, has a common history or a common story to tell. I will also say that when we have been really fortunate to be entitled eligible, meaning for national and state historic district eligibility, it is in our entirety. So that's all three subdivisions without cherry picking houses. And let me just say this one point to Chatfield Hills. We have had offline kind of discussions that once we get through this, should we look at across the street and see, are there houses that are intact and would perhaps qualify in as a house, but we're not there to do that now. And so, and there's very few. I did promise her, and I'll come back to you in a second.
Hi, thank you, Renee. My name is Katie Plum. I live on Richards Drive and have for over 30 years in Mrs. Haywood's house. And I must say that it's, I still feel incredibly safe over there. I'm just been so happy to be there and to be a part of you. Well, I know I'm an interloper, but I'm just thrilled to be there, and I'm, as part of your community and to support everything that it's so important to do. Also, my friend Nana Barry gave me a recommendation of a book, The Warmth of Other Suns. I'm sure many of you have read that, but if you haven't, the understanding of what the Black experience in the South was and why everybody went to New York and went to Chicago and went to California and what they went through to get, and the admiration for the Black experience and the strength in the genes. I don't mean to be a black-white thing, but I grew up in New York City, so I understand. I mean, I didn't grow up with understanding the way I understand it now. That's what I'm trying to say. And also, I wanted to ask one other thing about affirmative action. I always heard that it was through when affirmative action came in New York, and there was a law that, that certain these corporations, because my mother worked for ESSO in Rockefeller Center, and that there was a law that these big corporations had to, in the 60s, had to hire people from blacks, and I always had thought that was the reason why a lot of people came to, came out here. Black families came out here and were brought here. I don't know if that's true or not.
Thank you so much, and you're welcome anytime. No, to answer the question, no, it wasn't a form of affirmative action. It was seeking home, seeking family, seeking safety, seeking some sense of interaction. I'm a corporate person, and some people ask, well, why did you come in 2003? Because I think there's a belief that, well, that was then, and yeah, people have inherited houses, but the new folks, I heard that somebody who's a developer said that, oh, we just need to wait until the next generation. They'll never stay because they don't have to, that's not the only place they can live anywhere. And guess what? I came in 2003. I could have lived anywhere. I sold my house in Chappaqua. I could have lived anywhere. I chose here because it was a sense, because in college I came here for parties, and I just thought it'd be a fun place to be. So here's a question for you.
I'm Susan Enriquez Payne. I met my husband, Mike Payne, on the beach in Sag Harbor, and my family, who still are actively involved on Lighthouse Lane in Chatfield Hill. My father was interviewed by Allison, took pictures of the home. So we are still there. Pardon me?
One of the 5.
That's it. we came in 1946, so we are here to stay.
Yeah, and I think like moving forward with documentation and documenting the history, it's really important to recognize the people who settled in Chatfield Hill and Hillcrest Terrace as well. So.
Okay, I realized I saw her and then we were busy and I saw her again. So I would like a round of applause for Georgette. I know that you thanked me, but I have to thank Dr. Georgette Yerkey, because without her encouragement, I don't know if I would have been this far or sane. And I have to thank Sarah Couts, who's also one of our advisors, who's from Preserve Long Island. All right, Preservation Long Island. They changed their name on us a few times, once actually. But Georgette, you spoke to, and I just thought you could give you mentioned to me about looking at, of course, the 114. You said something about land versus.
Well, there were so many things. First of all, one thing I just want to say about the affirmative action thing, statistics. The number one person to benefit from affirmative action, the statistics show that who benefits from affirmative action? Many of us know the answer. What's the answer?
White females.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that we get that out because most of us know that. Many people know the answer, but some don't. So just so we have a premise to work on. That's one thing. And the other thing is to also know about, when we think about in terms of preservation, we are actually we're actually working backwards. And this is why this has been such a hard fight. And Mr. Williams, right? He actually started to thank Renee, which let's give her a round of applause again. Right. Let's also give her husband, Mr. Eglin, please stand up. Let's give him a round of applause. Because there's many nights that you have no idea what Renee does and how much she's on the phone, texting, and she's retired. You have no idea what she's going through. I know, because I'm sometimes on the phone with her. So anyway, but as far as this preservation thing, right? We are actually doing a lot of work and working backwards, right? We have, and these ladies too, they're with us. A lot of stressed out pulling hair. You think that we work for some of the agencies that should be working for us. A lot of times we fighting. I'm saying, look, I don't work for the State Office of Historic Preservation. Why are we having this conversation? So we are actually doing a lot of work that we really shouldn't be doing, and we have this conversation, like we are actually the advocates for the community that we're representing. So we have these conversations. And the reality is that a lot of things could be done with the wand. It could be knighted into place right now. So we are actually self-funding things. The community, you guys, many of you have put up your own money to actually have this work being done. Round of applause for yourself. So, but really, this work could be done. We have a certified local government here in the village where a lot of this work could have been done. So there are a lot of things that could just be done. Even the fact that Chatfield Hills is not here and included. The land itself, just the land without the houses can be actually preserved, am I right? It could be landmarked, right? Right now, we just have the college where I work, Nassau Community College. We know that this was a historic property where we have the first flight. Right now, it just got its historic landmark, right? Mitchell Field. So just even if it's not even existent, the land itself, the fact that it was previously owned and held, the land itself can be landmarked. Pyrrhus Concert, the project, didn't you do archaeology for me? Is the land, it can be actually landmarked because something of significance and historic significance and importance happened there. The fact that this land was held and owned, it can be landmarked, just like that. So even if it's from different levels of government, and the fact that you need, of course, the 51% to say, yes, we want it to be landmarked, that is what is needed to actually have it happen. And that's why engaging, having this open forum, speaking to the community, having not just the people here, but your counterparts involved, that's what we need to have the continued reach out to your community members is what we need to continue to educate the general public. And that's what we need to have it to go forward. Keep talking to one another, keep educating, keep being engaged, and that's what we need. But it's not, the landmarking is about the collection of the stories. Yes, we need to have some contributing housing, but it's bigger. It's about the collection of the stories. So you don't really need the physical evidence of the house. The land itself can be actually landmarked. That's for Chatfields or whatever the other one. Okay? So that's what it's really about. If it was necessary, and that is what was decided in the future. Okay?
And we'll help once we get through this and I take a nap and I'll come back and help with that. But again, Georgette has been an unbelievable advocate for us and also telling our story more broadly within the state. I know Jackie wants to say something. Is it a question or a statement or a testimonial?
Testimonial.
Okay, and yours, question or a testimonial? Bill is back here. Anybody have a question? I'll come back to you. Okay.
Hi, Allison. My name is Mike Payne, as you know.
Yes.
I had a question about Sylvester Manor and the connection that might exist. It's just a chance between the end of slavery in New York in the 1820s and the fact that the Sylvester Manor was a slave plantation on Shelter Island. Did the ex-slaves, the freed slaves from Sylvester Manor come to Sag Harbor? Do you know?
Well, actually, I think there is a connection between one individual in particular between Shelter Island and Sag Harbor, and his name is Hempstead. Yeah, David Hempstead. Yeah.
Sylvester Manor.
Well, he came from Shelter Island. I don't know if he came from Sylvester Manor itself.
The Darings are married to the Sylvesters.
The Darings and the Sylvesters.
And there were slaves in the village itself.
Okay, and so, but there were, you know, so when we think about the captive slave experience, we have to think about the diversity of people that were involved. There were people of African descent, there were Native American folks that were enslaved at Sylvester Manor, which was a big part of the UMass Boston's archaeological interpretation of the site. And they're connected to, you know, indigenous folks in the area. So all of these people of color employed in various free and restricted labor positions are all tied together. Are there connections between Shelter Island and Sag Harbor? I'm sure there are, right? And I think that these can be developed in histories of the 17th and the 18th century. I think that's where we should be going from this point on, because the experience for African descended people and Native American people is quite diverse. It's quite unique on the East End. I mean, I think it's really worth exploring both at the local level and also in terms of what it can offer in terms of our national narratives of history. So yes.
If I can, go ahead.
Further, we have to be clear. It wasn't a slave plantation. It was a provisioning plantation. Okay, so that's the difference. It was a provisioning plantation, so it wasn't a slave plantation. It was a provisioning plantation, which meant that they grew all the food there to send back to the plantation. And yes, there is when you see David Hempstead, his father also was David Hempstead. Now, David Hempstead and his sister Mary Hempstead, they grew up there. Their father was enslaved there. And you see that David Hempstead, you see the street Hempstead that they're talking about. That is the direct connection to Sylvester Manor. And you also see that David Hempstead had property over there, and there was a lawsuit and a dispute. And when he came over, so when you see St. David AME Zion, he was commissioned to also gather the money along with the Cuffey family, Lewis family, to build the church. So there is a direct connection to Sylvester Manor through the Hempstead.
Yeah, well, I'd also like to point out that, though, as a provisioning plantation, it wasn't just provisioning like food commodities for the transportation between the Barbados plantation and the plantation on Sylvester Manor. There was also the transportation of people as commodities, as captive laborers. So that should not be forgotten as well.
And just one other point, Dawn Marie Bonds, who's not here, who is, I don't have the right title, but she is what? She's an archivist, curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor, mentioned to me the other day, and I'm going to tell you why she was there, because we were working with Noma. She mentioned that she just came from a meeting or something with East Hampton, that their main street, there are a number of houses there that it has been documented that slaves were part of the households. And they now plan to actually note each house along that area. And I'm told the person she worked with said she will never look at Main Street in the same way again, knowing what happened, that these were slave-owning households on Main Street. East Hampton, exactly. I have two testimonials, and I want, it's a quarter of, I want to sum up and then just tell you a little bit of what our next steps are. So Jackie Vaughn, who was our calendar person, and let me say with the calendar, you think a calendar is a calendar? It wasn't just a calendar. It had ads from local businesses, and what she did, I don't know how she did it, but she had everyone's birthday listed on that date, anniversaries, memorials that were there, and every year we bought those as a fundraiser for the association in Sag Harbor Hills.
Thank you. I can't take credit. My husband, that was his idea. I follow along as a loyal wife. But it was a great thing to do, and the thing I want to point out is I'm kind of old now, but I don't know how many of you can remember way back in 1942. That's my first visit out here. And my eldest sister and my brother-in-law, who happens to be the great-uncle of Nia Long, the actress, because there were 7 of them. But he and his brother, another uncle of Nia's, rented a house in Eastville. Had no hot water, had the coal stove, and I'm sorry, I'm born in Harlem. We had gas stove. And this was primitive stuff. You had to boil the water because I came down as the teenage nanny to take the kids to the beach. Because we had no car, the men drove out on Friday nights and drove back on Sunday nights, and we had to walk wherever we were going. But the point was, it was something for me I never experienced. Because, as I said, born in Harlem, we had hot water. Maybe we didn't always get the heat we needed, but we had all of the facilities there. And it was an experience. The second time I came out, it was Ivy Cottage, the famous Ivy Cottage on 114. But the thing was, the only thing, my memory then, there was nothing but woods. All of this area was woods. And the experience that I have, the only people that I can remember were the pharaohs. And I didn't know they were Native Americans. We didn't know. I met the daughter Olive. So the older people here will remember. And she had to bring her brothers down to the beach to babysit them. I had to bring the nieces and nephews down. But I never knew she was Native American. I didn't know until when I came back out as an adult. And that she was Native American. So those are the experiences that I can remember way back when, never thinking in life that I'd ever be a homeowner. And when we became homeowners, we threw our whole enthusiasm into getting the roads and getting the water and doing whatever we could do to become a part of this beautiful community that we have out here. So all I can say is we're hoping maybe we can start the calendar again. My daughter taking after her mother and father. But get interested, be a part of it. Come out and join us. I've been past president of the Eastville Society, and God bless Georgette. She helped me through long years. But the point is this, don't stay home. Come out and support us. Support the groups, support SANS, and make this community stay alive.
Thank you. And I'd also like to say, support Safe Sag Harbor, support Safe Sag Harbor Partnership, because they have helped tremendously. Of those who are here, if you're in Safe Sag Harbor or Sag Harbor Partnership, raise your hand. I know I paid dues once. Okay.
Just a couple of quick comments. First of all, I want you to add the name Harry Belafonte to the Lena and Langston group, because that name will resonate in Albany. Harry bought a house here way back when. I'd like to also say that I used to work for the Barry family. I was 15 years old when I went and worked as a summer job in the hardware store and the furniture store for the Barry family way back in the 50s. And it was a great thing because I met the Chivonis and the Barry family and so forth, and we grew up together. And the Farrow, Georgie Farrow, was my childhood friend out here. And I knew he was an Indian. But I didn't have any friends named Farrow in Brooklyn. But it's a wonderful thing, and Sag Harbor is so special. It's such a special place in our lives. I've grown up here. I've been here 71 years and have a lot of friends around town. So we have to keep this going, folks. My aunt, Aunt Hawley, her name was Ann Hawley. She lived on Hempstead Street from 1908 until 1953. She was a school teacher for Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee. Taught English. She taught me English as well. But she was an old Sag Harbor hand. We had an outhouse, which I was not used to because we had 4 bathrooms in our home in Brooklyn. But that's the way we lived, and we grew up out here. This is a special place, and we want to keep it that way. So let's fight, fight, fight in the right way.
So he's saying fight, fight, fight. What we want is, all right, so we're going to close on the last 5 minutes. So what do we want? We would love to have national and state historic district so that when we're part of history and not a footnote. I think that's the thing that we have to really decide. Do we want to be part of history or do we want to be a footnote? And so I think many, because we did get the 51% folks really across all 3 subdivisions saying, you know, we really are interested. So this is a really mammoth thing. I also want to go back to the point that Georgette mentioned, that in 1980, 1990 for sure, there's a gentleman who just recently passed. His name is Pete Davies. And in his obituary written by his partner, Mark Scherzer, mentioned how much work he did for Sag Harbor Hills and the SANS area in looking at its own historic district. And so this didn't just start with Renee Simon's 2015. It actually was begun before that in 1990. And in his, in the paperwork, because I was able to see it, thank you to Catherine and Bernice Giscombe who got the materials to me. It states how they basically said that the African American area should be considered for landmarking for, historic district then. And the only reason it was not done then was that we were 10 years shy of the 50-year benchmark that the state uses. So then was 1990. Today, we're in 2018. So it should have been done then, wasn't done by the village. I did ask the village to, just for facts,
And those who know me know I just say it as it is, right? I asked, I provided the information, and the village basically said, hear you, but we're not going to give you any resources or manpower to do this. And if you want to do it on your own, we'll give you unanimous approval. So we've done it on our own. And so we're here. So we're here we are. So one of the next steps was one big hurdle we did do this past weekend. We got 2 weeks ago, because maybe 3 or so weeks ago, I got a letter from the state that basically said, this is all wonderful, you're doing such a great job. And here's your next thing to do. You need to have building descriptions for every house in SANS, which is 306 houses. And you have to meet our standard in terms of descriptions. There's a kind of preservationist language, there's historian language, there's architectural language. Not my first, I'm an MBA. I can run a mean P&L. I can run major $1 billion and $1 million businesses, but I can't write a description in a building. Put that out, and one of our residents, Gary McNeil, was a past commissioner in the city, but he also started a group called NOMA, N-O-M-A, National Organization of Minority Architects. He put out a note to the president, who was his mentee like 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, and said, we need help. In a week and a half or so, because they're very good about technology, they sent out a note saying, hey, look, and I gave them all our history that we had. Read this, look at this, read this, read this. Here's the newspaper articles. They got a lot of Sag Harbor Express, East Ham, kind of articles. And we had 27 people sign up to come up this past weekend to stay overnight and do it. And oh by George, in 2 days, they surveyed, documented, described 306 houses, and it's ready. I think that the state thought it would take months and we'd go away, but we didn't. It's done. So that is one of the steps, and thank you. We're going to probably move forward with we will be moving forward with the actual formal nomination. I understand the fact that we were judged to be eligible. It's somewhat procedural, but it's never done until it's done. It's my feeling. We will be asking for all your support to keep the support going. We need your support. We need you to be aware of what's going on. We didn't want to keep it a secret. We wanted to share what it was. And, thank you. That's all I can tell you. This is a blessing. Thank you.